What's up guys, Coach Az back again with the fundamental series, and today we're going to be going over the lead hook. So the lead hook, it's one of the first power punches that you're going to learn how to throw, and it's the first power punch you'll learn to throw off of the lead arm. So as always, we're going to break it down into its fundamentals, some common mistakes, some variations, and then some applications for this great punch. So let's get it started. The fundamentals of the hook start with understanding its direction of attack. So unlike our jab and our cross that comes straight down the center, the hook is the punch that comes around the target. So whether that be to the head, hitting the temple or to the chin, or coming up underneath, attacking to the body. The first detail we'll address is the hand position. So when you throw your hook, a lot of people will tell you that you need to throw it like this with your thumb facing towards you. Or, of course, you can throw it like this with your thumb facing up to the ceiling. Personally, I think this all comes down to preference. And I find that through different variations and applications, I like to change the positioning of my hand. So as we go through these different strikes today, guys, please make sure that you're experimenting with both. And depending on your guard and your personal preference, you might find you lean more to one or the other. But it really does just come down to preference. The key detail of the hook is in the rotation of the body. So all the power that is generated through the rotation and the pivot of our body. The important thing to understand is if I just throw a hook with just my arm, then it's just my arm in terms of my body weight that's going behind the strike. However, if I rotate, pivoting my foot, my knee, my hip, my shoulder, I'm then twisting and bringing my body weight in behind the punch. So a really important thing to understand early on is how to pivot correctly into the hook. When teaching the lead hook, I like to go from a bottom-up approach. So starting with the feet and then working our way up to the punch. So taking a look at the feet, obviously we're going to be in our stance. A nice, stable, balanced stance is important. We're going to be pivoting on this lead foot. So it's going to be the lead foot that is twisting into the strike. Now, by starting at the bottom, this just allows us to pay attention to what parts of the body are involved in the rotation. Starting from the foot pivoting, which is going to turn your knee, which is going to turn your hip, which is going to bring your shoulder round into the punch. So as I pivot round, if I'm paying attention to my foot, everything else is then going to follow, moving up through the mechanics into the punch itself. Of course, as always, we're keeping the back arm up by the chin and we're bringing that punch straight up and round and back to the target. Like most strikes, the hook has some common mistakes that I see a lot of people making as a beginner. So let's go through them so you can make sure you're not doing the same. The first, and we've discussed this with all the punches in the fundamental series, is loading up. So by that I mean either pulling your arm back or gearing your body up so that you're going to overcommit into that strike. Of course, the problem with this is that it's a huge tell. It's telegraphing to our opponent what we're going to throw and what direction it's going to come from. So we want to make sure that, especially when we're learning it to start with and whenever we're training these fundamental techniques, that we go back to basics, throwing it from the guard and coming straight out into the technique. From here, straight through to the technique without needing to gear it up unnecessarily. The next common mistake, we covered it in the fundamentals. It's not utilizing that rotation in the body. So it's taking your stance and guard, but it's thinking of it from more of a top-down approach where you're so focused on throwing the arm that you forget or you don't pay attention to the rotation through the rest of the body. This is why I like to teach it from the bottom upwards, because by focusing on twisting my foot as I punch, it ensures that my knee, my hip, and my shoulder are going to turn, bringing my body into the strike. Third common mistake is haymakering. So this is where we are overextending the arm. We're reaching too far out and wide with it. Again, similar to the idea of loading up on the punch, we're telegraphing to our opponent what we're going to do, and we're giving them more opportunity to be able to react, respond, and even counter us with the technique. Remember, just swinging your arm as wild as you can is not going to generate the maximum amount of power or speed. technique needs to come first. So tidy everything up, tighten it up. We talk about fighting in a phone booth or fighting in a small elevator. If you apply these principles, it's going to tighten all your technique up, and that's going to ensure that you're throwing it with maximum speed and maximum power. Small, subtle changes can really change the way we approach the hook punch. So let's take a look at a few variations of how we can throw this strike. The first variation is the classic lead hook, but what we didn't talk about in the fundamentals is the different ranges that it can be thrown at. And the best way to think about these 3 different ranges that I'm going to talk about is by looking at the angle at the elbow. So from the forearm to the upper arm, how big is that angle? And that's going to determine which of these 3 hooks you are throwing. Starting with the medium range hook. We're going to start in the middle because that's going to give us a good base point to then understand what the short range and the long range will look like. The medium range is working effectively at a right angle. So think of the classic lead hook coming round to the head, and we're thinking about a mid-range strike. So by mid-range, I mean this in a boxing term, in the sense that our jab is our long range technique, and then a hook would come round a little bit shorter than what the range of our jab would be. So we're not at the fully extended distance of our arm, we're in a bit shorter, and again, 90-degree right angle at the arm is what we're looking for. To get the short range hook, we're going to close that angle down and make it smaller than 90 degrees. So what we're dealing with here is a clinch situation, or being shoulder to shoulder or head to head with our opponent. So at this point, now when I throw my hook, I'm trying to tighten up that angle in on the hook punch. So instead of it being 90 degrees, it's closer to 45 or kind of 70, 60 degrees closed in. That punch is coming in a lot closer to you because you are a lot closer to your opponent. And finally, the long range hook. The long range hook, of course, now we're going beyond 90 degrees. Now we've got to be careful because we've talked about in the common mistakes about the concept of haymakering. That's not what we want to do. But what we do want to do is extend just beyond that 90 degrees to be able to get a longer reach and a longer range. Generally, hooks are not expected at a long range. So if you gain the ability to be able to throw them a little bit longer than what they normally would be, you can often catch people off guard. You can also then really effectively use your hook to set up follow-up strikes, such as your cross off of your rear arm side. The body hook is a technique all to itself, and in the future I'll do a video dedicated to it, but I just wanted to cover some of the main differences between throwing a body hook and throwing the hook to the head. The main difference is going to be in the direction of your arm. So you can throw a body hook coming straight across horizontally, but more often than not, you will see a body hook coming more into an upward direction. So somewhere in between an uppercut and a regular hook. We're at this diagonal line. The reason for this is often because we're trying to come underneath the guard. So if I come straight across, I'm giving my opponent quite a lot of opportunity to just drop that guard down and catch it with the cover. Whereas if I dig up underneath, especially if I'm coming more towards this front portion of the body, or I can adjust depending on where their guard moves, I've got more opportunity to slip that punch underneath the guard and strike into the body. In terms of the mechanics, they're very similar. So we're still rotating, we're still pivoting round. Like I said, the main difference is going to be in the angle of your arm. You can practice it both ways, shooting straight across, but we're coming in a little lower. That can be done through bending the knees or just simply lowering the point of the elbow from the point of the shoulder. Alternatively, like I said, we can come across, pivoting in, but coming in almost in an upward direction through that diagonal line so that we're striking up into our opponent underneath the floating ribs, aiming for that liver shot as well. One thing to always be aware of when throwing the body hook is it can leave you very vulnerable to counters. You need to think that when you're throwing that body hook, that lead side, especially up at your head, is very exposed. If I'm throwing it to the head, my shoulder's here, my arm is here, and it's very quick to retrieve it and pull it back. But if I'm throwing it to the body, I need to just have an understanding that this side is vulnerable to a counter attack. So this is where setups and throwing it off of a combination become vitally important. The last variation we'll talk about today is the no pivot hook. I remember seeing training footage of Manny Pacquiao where he was working on the pads and he was just throwing lead arm hooks with absolutely no rotation. So here we're breaking the very fundamental rule that I established with you at the start of the video. For this variation, we're just trying to stay as solid as possible in our stance with our guard, and with no tell and no signal of what's coming, shoot that hook straight round, just throwing it from the shoulder passed down into the arm. Now I consider this to be a very advanced variation on the hook. I think you need to have a very keen understanding of the main fundamental principles before attempting to throw or land this strike. Note, this is not meant to be the better version of the hook. This is not a replacement for knowing and understanding how to throw a hook properly. However, what this is as someone as established as Manny Pacquiao is and the opponents that he's facing, they understand what to look for on a very microscopic level in terms of seeing a hook being thrown, looking for that rotation in the foot or in the hip or at the shoulder. So what he's doing is he's purposely removing a lot of the signs of even a good hook punch with the hopes that it's going to create an opening for him to land. Now, of course, understand that if we're throwing a hook like this with absolutely no pivot, we are going to lose a considerable amount of the power in the strike. However, if we can land this strike or put it into combination with something else, then it's a great way to set us up to land future strikes. Take, for example, throwing a no pivot hook to the body to then rip into a proper hook up to the head. The speed of that first one might mean that we either catch them to the body or we do enough to draw their guard and attention down and create an opening upstairs for a more traditional hook punch. So let's take a look at a few ways that you can apply the hook punch. Now, of course, you can put the hook, and it's most suited to being put in a combination. So for example, the fundamental 1-2-3, a jab cross hook punch. However, I want to give you some applications that work for the punch to serve it on its own. But of course, mix these into your combos, mix these into your pad work, and you can hopefully apply any of the variations we've talked about with some of the applications that we're going to work here today. The first application is the slip and rip. So here we're taking advantage of what a slip does to help set us up to throw an effective hook punch. What I'm doing here, I'm working this out of right stance, guys, as a southpaw, because I just feel on the cameras and where the bag is, it's going to be easier for you to see. I'm pivoting towards the outside of my lead foot. So from here, as I pivot out to slip, depending on their stance, if we're fighting open, it might be a jab. If we're closed, it might be a cross. But what this has done is it's primed my body and set me up to then counter-rotate back towards and shoot that hook. So from here, as I pivot myself away and hopefully miss an incoming strike, I can take advantage of the opening that I've left on my opponent, and my body is primed to rotate back the other way. The slip to the rip into that hook. And again, that could go to the body, that could come to the head, that could be thumb up or thumb across. Any variation that you like, but practice that basic fundamental application of slipping to the outside and ripping back through that center line. Our next application is going to be the roll to lead hook. Made famous by Mike Tyson, this is a great technique to get to grips with if you are a smaller fighter. So if you're small for your weight class, small for your division, using a roll to get you into range is a really effective way of slipping taller fighters' punches, getting you on the inside, and then utilizing that as an advantage to throw a powerful hook punch off of the end of it. So not only are we going to be rolling underneath to shoot our hook, but I actually want you to move forward as you do it. So with that, I want you to push off your feet as you roll and come in to shoot that strike. From there, as you come down to that lowest point, use that lowest point to drive up with your feet, shift you into range, and come up with that hook. So not only have we got the rotational force of coming up through the roll, but we've also got the push off the feet to project us forward into the right range to shoot our hook. And as we spoke about with the slip, the idea here is that we're making our opponent miss, leaving them open and vulnerable and hopefully being on their blind side so they don't see the punch coming. Remember, it's the punch you don't see coming that knocks you out. This application is of course quite bold and aggressive. You can play with the range, so depending on how close you get while rolling into the distance, you can play with those 3 different ranges we spoke about earlier: the short range hook, the mid-range hook, and the long range. The last application we'll look at is the check hook. The check hook is a classic counter hook punch. The idea being here that we pivot ourselves off the line of attack. So as our opponent attacks forward onto us, we pivot off that line and replace the target that they were aiming for, which is probably our head, with our weapon, our fist, as it comes round to strike in the head. For this application, take what we learned in the fundamentals about that pivot on the lead foot, but now imagine that as you're pivoting that lead foot, you're going to take your back foot around off of this center line. So if I'm facing directly towards you here, as I take that back foot round and pivot on that lead leg, you can see the opening I've created down this center. So this is where my opponent wants and expects me to be, and this is where I end up as they come into range to attack me. Now, as I'm pivoting off that line, as I'm making them miss, I'm already initiating my hook. So like I said, we've gone back to the fundamentals of that pivot. And as I'm pivoting, I'm already initiating that hook. So as their strike passes me and their chin comes into range, I'm using all of that rotational power and taking myself off the line to create that opening and come up over the top with that check hook. You check their strike as it approaches and you come round up and over with your counter. Now, of course, this technique comes down to timing. It's all about practice and repetition, and everything that we've worked today, it always comes back to get into the gym, get onto the pads, get onto the bags and drill it. Drilling and repetition is what's going to turn these skills into weapons. Then you can start implementing it into your sparring and trying to land it on your partners and eventually onto your opponents. Guys, I hope you've been finding this fundamental series helpful and useful. I've really enjoyed making them. If you want to see any other content from us or want me to cover any specific techniques, please leave it down in the comments below and I will see you on the next one.